No living person knows for certain how to say the name of the God of the Bible. It is the most important word in Western religion, and its true sound is lost. The four letters survive. The vowels that once filled them do not. For more than 2,000 years, devout readers have reached that name on the page and stopped and said something else instead. The silence was not an accident. Someone built it on purpose. And there is a stranger thing still. When we follow the oldest traces of that name backward out of the temples and the scrolls, they do not lead us into the heart of Israel at all. They lead us south, out past the edge of the settled land, into the desert, into the country of herders and metalworkers who were never Israelites. Tonight, we go looking for where Yahweh came from. Open a Hebrew Bible, and the name is everywhere. It appears nearly 7,000 times. 4 consonants, written right to left, that scholars render with the letters YHWH, the tetragrammaton, which simply means the 4 letters. But here is the problem that haunts every translator. Ancient Hebrew was written without vowels. The reader supplied them from memory, the way you might read a word with the middle scooped out. And for this one word, the memory was deliberately allowed to fade. At some point centuries before the Common Era, a rule took hold. The name was too holy to pronounce. So whenever a reader reached those 4 letters, they did not say them. They said Adonai instead, which means my Lord. The written name and the spoken name came apart. Generation after generation, the eye saw one thing and the mouth said another, until almost no one alive had ever heard the name said aloud. That is the open loop we will follow to the end. A name preserved in writing and erased in sound on purpose. But before we ask who silenced it, we have to ask where it came from. And the answer is not where you would expect. Here is the thesis, and it unsettles a very old assumption. We tend to imagine that the God of Israel was always the God of Israel, born there, belonging there, native to the hill country where his people lived. But the oldest poetry in the Bible does not place his home there at all. It places it in the desert to the south. Listen to where the most ancient verses say he comes from. In one of the oldest songs in all of Scripture, the Song of Deborah, Yahweh marches out from a place called Seir, from the open country of Edom, and the earth trembles as he comes. In the blessing of Moses, he dawns like a sunrise from Seir and shines out from Mount Paran and comes from the desert region of the south. Another old poem says plainly that God comes from Teeming, a district of Edom. Seir, Edom, Paran, Teeming. These are not names from the heartland of Israel. They are names of the southern deserts, the dry country, southeast of the Dead Sea, far from the cities and the temple. The oldest memory in the text remembers Yahweh not as a settled God of the land, but as a storm coming up out of the wilderness. A God who arrives from somewhere else. So scholars ask the obvious question. If he comes from the south, did his worship come from there too? And the trail led to a desert people and to the strangest scene in the story of Moses. Return to the moment the name is first revealed. It does not happen in Israel. It happens in exile, in the desert at the foot of a mountain, to a man who has fled for his life. In the book of Exodus, Moses has run from Egypt into the land of Midian, the desert country to the southeast. There he marries the daughter of a local priest and tends that priest's flocks. And it is there, while he is keeping the sheep of a Midianite, far from his own people, that he sees the bush that burns without being consumed. A voice speaks from the fire. Moses asks it for a name, and the voice answers with a riddle of a phrase, often rendered as I am that I am, and then gives him the 4 letters to carry back to Egypt. Read that scene as history rather than miracle, and a pattern jumps out. The name is not revealed in the Promised Land. It is revealed in the southern desert, in Midian, on a mountain, in the very region the old poems call Yahweh's home. The story itself locates the first knowledge of the name in the south. And there is the question the text raises but does not answer. Why does Moses learn this name out here, in someone else's country, who was already living at this mountain? The answer is standing right next to him. It is his father-in-law, and that man was not an Israelite. The priest of Midian has a name, or rather several. The text calls him Jethro. He is a Midianite, and in one important line he is also called a Kenite, a member of a nomadic clan whose name is tied to metal and to smithing. Watch what this priest does. After Moses leads the people out of Egypt, Jethro comes to meet them in the wilderness. And it is the Midianite priest who takes the lead in worship. He declares that Yahweh is greater than all gods. He offers the sacrifices. He instructs Moses. The outsider, the desert priest, behaves not like a new convert, but like a man who already knows this God. The text shows the Israelite learning the rites from the Midianite and not the other way around. This is the heart of what scholars call the Kenite hypothesis or the Midianite hypothesis. The idea is this: the worship of Yahweh may not have begun with Israel at all. It may have begun with these southern desert peoples, the Midianites and the Kenites, among the mountains and copper mines of the deep south. And a group that would later become part of Israel encountered that God out in the wilderness and carried his name and his worship north into the land. It is by its nature a hypothesis and a debated one. The biblical writers would hardly invent a foreign origin for their own God by accident, which is part of why the detail is striking. But poetry and patriarchs are one thing. To follow the name out of the Bible entirely, we needed it written down by someone who had never read the Bible at all. And remarkably, it was. This is the piece that turns a literary pattern into something harder. Far from Israel in the temples of Egypt, the pharaohs kept lists. When an army marched, scribes carved the names of foreign lands and foreign peoples into temple walls, like a catalog of the conquered. And in a small number of these inscriptions, from the late Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago, there appears a curious entry. It names a group of desert nomads, the lamassu, and it ties them to a place. The hieroglyphs spell out, as nearly as we can read them, the lamassu of Uich Irfhodlirf, the same consonants at the core of the divine name, carved by Egyptian scribes who had no stake in the Bible, who were simply recording the wandering herders of the southern deserts. The oldest of these inscriptions comes from a temple at a site called Soleb, built under a pharaoh of the 14th century before the Common Era. Centuries before Israel emerges clearly in the record, an Egyptian wall already links those three letters to a people of the southern wilderness. Scholars are careful here, and we should be too. In the Egyptian texts, this may first be the name of a place, a region, or an oasis, rather than a god. But it sits exactly where the biblical poems put Yahweh's home, among exactly the desert nomads the Kenite hypothesis points to. A name on an Egyptian wall, a home in the oldest Hebrew poetry, and a foreign priest who already knows the rites. Three separate trails, and all of them run south, into the desert, away from Israel. And that convergence is the turn. So here is the inversion, and it is a quiet earthquake. The God at the center of the Bible may not have been born inside the story the Bible tells. The oldest songs remember him marching up from Edom and Seir. The revelation of his name happens in Midian, at a desert mountain, in front of a Midianite priest who already worships him. And an Egyptian scribe with no Bible to copy from carved those same letters onto a temple wall and tied them to the nomads of that very desert, before Israel had clearly stepped onto the stage of history. Put those pieces together, as scholars like Mark Smith and Thomas Romer have, and a possibility emerges that overturns the assumption we started with. Yahweh may have begun as a god of the southern desert, a god of storm and mountain and metal, worshipped by herders and smiths on the far edge of the settled world. And the people who would become Israel did not inherit him from the beginning. They met him somewhere out in the wilderness and brought him home and slowly made him the only God there was. It is not proof. The threads are old and frayed, and honest scholars argue over every knot. But the direction of the evidence is consistent, and it points the same way every time. Away from the temple, out past the last village, into the desert, where the name was already being spoken aloud by people who left us almost nothing but their footprints. And that is the cruel irony of where this ends. Once in that desert, the name was something you simply said. By the time the tradition reached its height, no one was allowed to say it at all. So we return to the silence, and now we can watch it descend. In the earliest period, the name was spoken. It appears inside other names woven into the everyday. It is carved on storage jars and seals and scraps of letters dug out of the ground where ordinary people invoked it without fear. There was a time when the 4 letters were simply a word that a living tongue pronounced. Then, slowly, the awe hardened into a rule. By the centuries, just before the Common Era, the name was being withheld from common speech. In time, it was spoken aloud only by the high priest, only in the innermost room of the temple, only on the holiest day of the year. And when that temple was destroyed, even that one annual whisper had nowhere left to happen. The last place the name was said out loud was gone. After that, on the page the 4 letters remained, but on the tongue there was only the substitute, Adonai, my Lord. And here is the final twist, the one that gives us the famous misreading. Long after, medieval scribes called the Masoretes set out to preserve the exact sound of the Hebrew Bible, and they added small marks for the vowels. But when they reached the holy name, they could not write its true vowels because those were not to be spoken. So they wrote, under the 4 sacred consonants, the vowels of the word the reader was supposed to say instead, the vowels of Adonai. A later age, reading the consonants of one word with the vowels of another, fused the two into a hybrid that was never a real name at all. That accidental hybrid is where the familiar later form Jehovah comes from. A word produced not by memory, but by the very machinery built to hide the memory. The taboo did its work almost too well. It guarded the name by emptying it of sound. It kept the letters and lost the voice. And so the most spoken about God in human history became, quite literally, the God whose name no one is sure how to say. So consider what we have followed tonight, a name that fills the Bible nearly 7,000 times, and that no living person can say with certainty. The oldest poems remembering their God as a storm out of the southern desert, from Seir, from Edom, from Teman. A revelation that happens not in the promised land, but in Midian, at a mountain, before a foreign priest who already knew the rites. And 3 faint letters, YHW, carved on an Egyptian temple wall and tied to the nomads of that same wilderness, long before Israel clearly began. The trail does not give us certainty. It gives us a direction. South, into the desert, among the herders and the metalworkers, where a name was once spoken plainly that would later be wrapped in the deepest silence in religion. And that is the strange shape of this whole story. A name that began perhaps as an ordinary word on a desert tongue became so holy that speaking it was forbidden until the sound itself was lost. We have the 4 letters. We have the deserts they may have come from. We have the moment the silence fell. What we do not have is the one thing the people of that desert had without thinking, the sound of the name itself. Somewhere out past the edge of the maps it was once simply said aloud, and whether we will ever hear it again is a question still waiting in the sand.